Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everybody. Today, it's our great pleasure to have Professor Gautam Kalghatgi to give a seminar here on combustion webinar. Yeah? So the title of the webinar is it the end of combustion research as we know it? So Professor Gautam Kalghatgi worked for 31 years at Shell Research in the UK, followed by 8 years in Saudi Aramco before retiring in June 2018. He has been a visiting professor at Oxford University, Imperial College London, KTH Stockholm, TU Eindhoven, and Sheffield University, and has been recently appointed as a consultant professor at Shanghai Jiaotong University. He is a fellow of the Royal Academy of Engineering, SAE, and IMAC-E. He has published around 140 papers and a book, Fuel Engine Interactions, on combustion, fuel, and engine research, and on transport energy, and has also edited 2 other books on engine research. His work is cited widely with a current H index of 59 on Google Scholar. He has received many awards for his work, including the 2021 ASME International Combustion Engines Award, the Hu Edwards Award of the Institute of Physics for his contributions to combustion science, and the SAE Orning Award. He has a BTEC from IIT Bombay 1972 and a PhD from Bristol University 1975 in aeronautical engineering. His PhD project was on supersonic jet impingement. He did postdoctoral research on turbulent combustion at Southampton University from 1975 to 1979 before joining Shell. So Professor Gautam Kalghatgi, the floor is yours now.
Good morning, everyone, and good afternoon, whatever. And thank you very much for that introduction. This talk is based on a paper that I was invited to contribute to a special issue of Combustion and Flame to celebrate Ken Bray's 90th birthday. Unfortunately, the paper was rejected in the end by the editors. But if anyone is interested in the draft of the paper, please drop me an email at kalghatgig@gmail.com and I can send you a copy. Right, as you see, the title is it the end of combustion research as we know it? And should it be? Should it really be the end? Okay, let's address this question now. Sorry, what's happening here? Okay, right. Now, you know, there is widespread belief, especially in the affluent West, that the world will go through an existential crisis because of climate change. And therefore, energy policy in many countries is aiming for a rapid and drastic cut in greenhouse gas emissions. I mean, there are many, many examples. One of them is UK's commitment to net zero greenhouse gas by 2050. Of course, net zero means basically, actually it means replacement of all fossil fuels by 2050, if with a little bit of offsetting where you can't do it, basically. But the primary thing is get rid of all fossil fuels. Of course, President Biden actually fought the election saying that he will get rid of fossil fuels. I mean, so there is a distinct demonizing of fossil fuels and combustion. However, if you look at any energy policy, how does it develop? I mean, there are many, many drivers which govern energy transition. I mean, I've just put some boxes here. I mean, you can put your own boxes, I'm sure. And climate change is one of the drivers, actually, but it looks like in the Western affluent societies, climate change is the only thing and the main thing that is driving energy policy, essentially. And this is not necessarily the case everywhere because different countries have different requirements. I mean, in many developing countries, energy security and the availability of affordable energy is the critical thing, and that's what drives energy policy. And whatever it is, the scale of transition to meet net zero, that means getting rid of fossil fuels, is immense. And I think most often it is not sufficiently appreciated, either deliberately or by ignorance. So focusing only on climate change ignores this complexity anyway. Certainly, there's a lot of, in my opinion, dishonesty, a lack of sense of realism, and these need to be come to the fore in debate, in debates about all these things. I mean, more honesty and more sense of realism and so on. Now, where do we stand in terms of energy? Can everybody see the slides, by the way, properly? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Ignore the figures on the top because it's just too much to take in. Where does the world stand in terms of energy? I mean, this is from the Statistical Review of World Energy from BP in 2020, and the results are for 2019. I think the 2020 results are affected quite a lot by the pandemic, and I'm just waiting for the 2021 results to come out so that we can update all these things. But whatever it is, fossil fuels supplied 84% of global primary energy. Okay, and by incidentally, primary energy here means traded primary energy because that's the only thing they can measure. On top of this, they're probably between 5 to 10% of what is known as combustible renewables, which is basically very, very poor people. I mean, about 2 billion people burning wood and cow dung and things like that, which doesn't show up in these numbers. But whatever it is, we are talking about primary energy that's traded. 84% comes from fossil fuels. And the share of wind and solar in 2019 is just about 1.3%. Nuclear was about 4.3%, hydro about 6.4%. Okay. And the share of fossil fuels varies a little bit between, say, 79% in the UK to about 100% in Saudi Arabia, for example. In 2019, fossil fuels supplied 79 exajoules, that is 10 raised to 18 joules in the US, and of the total of 492 exajoules globally. And in the UK, it was about 6.2 exajoules. And in the UK, I mean, these are the numbers to just to keep in, get across to you the scale of the issue, okay? In the UK, accounts for about 1.3% of global fossil fuel use. We have to remember this. I'm going to use a lot of figures associated with the UK because, but you can just scale it up or scale it down for different countries like this. In the link I've shown there, or in the paper that the rejected paper that I wrote, there's a table with all these data, which might be of interest to a lot of people here. Okay, so this is what we have to remember. Now, what about, when we talk about wind and solar, we're really talking about electricity generation, because that's what they're doing. If you look at the details about electricity generation, electricity as a fraction of total primary energy globally is about 17%. Okay, I mean, in China, it's a bit higher, I mean, maybe 19%. And the share of wind and solar in electricity generation also varies quite a lot. Some countries are very far ahead. I mean, UK is about about 25%, I think, this year. And Germany is almost nearly 50%. But the global average, the world, wind and solar provide about 8% of electricity generation. Okay, when people talk a lot about, oh, all our electricity will come from wind and solar, what they're saying is we roughly 16% of all energy used will come from wind and solar. I mean, of course, that we are very far away from that target either. But what we have to remember, of course, is wind and solar are variable renewable energy sources because they don't provide energy all the time when you need it. And we have to look at the capacity factor, which is the ratio of actual energy provided to the theoretical maximum if either wind and solar operated continuously at rated capacity. I mean, I've got some figures here. I mean, if you look at the world in total, the average capacity factor in 2019 for the world for wind energy was just about 0.26. That means if you had 1,000 megawatts installed wind capacity, over the whole year, it provided about 260 megawatts. Solar is even less. In Northern Europe, I mean, not surprisingly, in the UK, solar is very, very poor. In the UK, it's about 11%. So if you had a 1,000 megawatt capacity of solar installed, you'd be lucky to get, 110 megawatts on average over the year. Right. So what does it mean in terms of energy transition requirements to reach net zero? I'm talking here about net zero, okay? Essentially getting rid of all fossil fuels. As I said, in the UK, fossil fuel contribution was about 6.21 exajoules. Let us assume that only 60% of this needs to be replaced by CO2-free energy. At the moment, it's basically wind, offshore wind for the UK, okay? And rest comes from efficiency improvements, lifestyle changes, etc. And these have to be accompanying these energy transitions as well. So to replace 60% of current fossil fuel use, UK will need to build 120 gigawatts of continuous CO2-free energy. This is equivalent to 40 Hinkley Point C nuclear power stations, 3 gigawatts each. To build one of these has taken more than 25 years in the UK, and it's still going on. And its costs are just escalating. It's about 28 billion pounds, I think, already it's going to cost. And or if you're thinking of offshore wind or something, you have to install 300 gigawatts of new wind, assuming a much improved capacity factor of 0.4. You remember, capacity factor was only about 0.3 actually at the moment on average in the UK. On top of this, much greater effort is needed to dismantle the existing infrastructure, build new infrastructure, change in, lifestyles drastically. For the very least, to make it make people use energy more efficiently and so on. In the UK, this means replace 26 million gas boilers, because most of space heating is through gas heating with gas boilers. You have to completely rebuild the electricity infrastructure, because it's not just in terms of power generation and so on, but it is the last bit of the grid that comes into the homes that needs to be totally rebuilt. Of course, you have to improve the energy efficiency of the building, and you have to build charging infrastructure for electric vehicles. I'll come to that bit in a minute. You have to look at transport in particular and tackle the enormous environmental and economic impacts which accompany this kind of change. Because remember, renewables are not necessarily free of environmental and economic impacts. You have to, for example, just to get rid of, say, wind turbines and solar panels at the end of their life is going to be a huge task. And once again, remember the scale of the problem. How much more we are hoping to increase these things. On top of this, of course, essentially, we have to dismantle aviation, steel, cement industries, and livestock farming, or the oil and gas industry in the next whatever number of years. I mean, in this country, for instance, the UK, in the next 30 years, okay? The urgency and the engineering plans to achieve all this in the next 30 years or so are simply not there. And UK will absolutely certainly miss its net zero target. There's no question about this, you know. And of course, it's even less likely that the world as a whole can reduce greenhouse gases significantly. I mean, for example, will Saudi Arabia and Russia, I mean, of course, we'll come to that towards the end, give up their oil and gas industry? I mean, will India cull its cattle? Because, you know, India has the largest number of cattle, is the country with the largest number of the cattle. And if you want to reduce greenhouse gas emissions from cattle farming, I mean, you have to really get rid of the cattle. The long and short of this is that combustion and fossil fuels will continue to be central for decades to come across the world. And even in countries where they are making you know, efforts to get rid of combustion. Right. I mean, I just want to bring to your attention some other examples of wishful thinking, greenwashing, and straightforward dishonesty, which comes up again and again in the popular press. For example, there's a lot of talk about e-fuels, you know, made from CO2 and hydrogen for aviation. Okay, let's look some back of the envelope calculations. Global annual energy demand for aviation is about 18 exajoules. You know, and the production and that's about 1.4 billion liters of aviation fuel each day, by the way. And the production efficiency for e-fuels is around 44–45%. The world will have to build equivalent of about 430 nuclear power plants to actually supply enough electricity to do this. These are all 3 gigawatt of huge plants, by the way. Similarly, biofuels for aviation, even if they made environmental sense, if they contain oxygen, their gravimetric energy content will be less, about say 15–16% less than, you know, less than conventional fuels. And in any case, how much of the 1.4 billion liters each day can you replace with these things? And there is talk about offsetting greenhouse gases from aviation. I mean, again, you know, you could again make a simple calculation saying the world will have to build plant forests the size, roughly the size of France every year to offset the carbon dioxide produced by aviation. Every year, by the way. And of course, there is some wild target set. Last year, the head of the Royal Air Force said that he set a target for net zero for British military aircraft by 2040. I mean, if you're talking about, I mean, it is actually touching that people whose main aim is to kill other people want to do so in a climate-friendly way. But nevertheless, it is not going to be possible, for example, if you want to replace run a Eurofighter Typhoon, for example, on batteries. The battery itself will weigh 13 times the maximum takeoff weight to contain the same energy as the fuel it carries at the moment. Again, you know, because wind and solar are variable renewables, they need a lot of storage capacity. And this is not simple. For example, I mean, just to give you this example, in the UK, The largest plant project in the UK is about 640 megawatt hour of capacity, which is currently projected to cost about 200 million pounds. But this will supply London's peak demand for power for less than 5 minutes, basically. So you need huge amounts of storage capacity. And of course, all the corporations, including oil companies and fashion houses, are announcing their own net zero targets, whatever that might mean. And quite a lot of is simply greenwashing, or people just don't realize what they need to do. Right. Okay, let's now focus a little bit on transport. Transport is probably the most difficult sector to decarbonize. Globally, transport accounts for about 14% of greenhouse gases, if you include things like methane and nitrous oxide, and about 25% of CO2 emissions. Currently, again, the scale is enormous. We have to appreciate this. Currently, over 1.3 billion light-duty vehicles, cars and vans and things like that, and over 380 million commercial vehicles. Okay, in the UK, there are 37 million light-duty vehicles. However, light-duty vehicles account for only 45% of global transport energy demand. Aviation is about 12%, and the rest is from basically mostly from commercial road vehicles, long-distance lorries and so on. Transport is essentially driven by liquid fuels for very good reasons, because they have high energy density, they're easy to store, transport and store, and therefore over the past 120 years or so, an extensive infrastructure to support this has grown. And it is not going to be easy to get rid of this, by the way. Again, the scale you have to remember. Every day, the world uses over 4.9 billion liters each of gasoline and diesel, and about 1.4 billion liters of jet fuel. That's about more than 11 billion liters of liquid fuel each day. And the demand for transport energy is growing, almost entirely in non-OECD countries. And also we have to remember that oil, that's petroleum, and transport are closely linked. Currently, 95% of all transport energy comes from petroleum, and 60% of petroleum goes to make transport fuels. Of course, we are all familiar with all the desire to replace current engines by electric vehicles. And we also know that there are different degrees of electrification. And if you want to get rid of fossil fuels and combustion, you have to go for full electrification, because only battery electric vehicles do not have an internal combustion engine, and all their energy comes from the electricity grid. Of course, hybrid electric vehicles like the Toyota Prius are partially electrified. They have a very small battery, and however, all the power comes from the internal combustion engine, but it's much more efficiently used. And also you recover brake energy, etc., because of the electric drive. And in between, you have plug-in hybrid electric vehicles, which you can plug them in to the grid, but they give you a much smaller range on electricity alone. There is absolutely no question that electrification light-duty vehicles will increase very significantly in the futures. And in fact, I think it should be more in the form of hybrid electric vehicles, because this is the best way to go forward. But let's see what happens. Now, what is the outlook for electrification? As I said, there is no question that sales of battery electric vehicles are increasing extremely rapidly. Okay, in the UK in 2021, around 11% of all new car sales were battery electric vehicles. It's a bit distorted in the UK because more than half of them come from company cars and fleets and so on. And there is huge incentives for them to buy battery electric vehicles at the moment. And however, by the end of 2021, the BEV stock, battery electric vehicle stock, was just about 1% of total number of passenger cars in the UK. We have to remember this, okay? And the global stock of battery electric vehicles after 2021 is probably less than that, about 0.8% of all cars in the world. And the US, it's about 0.7%, I think. And remember that globally, the LDV numbers are expected to grow from about the current number of about 1.3 billion to 1.7 to 1.9 billion. So what this means is if internal combustion engines are to be eliminated from light duty vehicles, and also we have to remember that current battery electric vehicles are essentially small cars with small batteries, and more than half of them, by the way, are in China. If you want to eliminate LDVs from all sectors of, ICEs from all sectors of light duty vehicles, the battery capacity needs to increase by a factor of at least 200, I think, basically. Yeah, even if you did that, this addresses only 45% of total transport energy demand. You still have 55% of transport energy used in commercial way, long distance lorries and aviation and so on, coming from fossil fuels. Of course, such a massive increase in battery electric vehicles, it really will be unsustainable in environmental, in terms of environmental and economic impacts. For example, what we have to remember is BEVs are certainly not zero emission vehicles, okay? The greenhouse gas impact quite clearly depends on how electricity use is generated. Battery production itself is extremely energy intensive and GHG intensive, and it could generate between 90 to 125 kilograms of CO2 equivalent per kilowatt hour of battery capacity. So the larger the battery, the worse the impact, and you'll start with this deficit before you've driven a single kilometer on this. In many parts of the world, certainly in India and China, BEVs will cause more CO2 because the electricity grid is not sufficiently decarbonized. In fact, we have a paper coming out in Nature, in Nature Climate Communications, where we have looked at the cases in India. And it clearly shows that if at all India wants to go down this route to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, it will have to, first of all, change its electricity generation. And it's not going to happen in any rush at the moment. We will come to that as well in a minute. Of course, if coal is the main source of power, electric power, as in India and China, PM 2.5, NOx, and sulfur dioxide will also be worse. Of course, coal power stations are getting cleaner, and no question about that. But if they're not, like in many countries, basically you are displacing this pollution from where you use a car to where the power is generated. This is simple common sense. We know this. And there is a lot of studies looking at it, especially in China, because China is trying to clean up the power systems. And even then, this is an important factor. But the hidden thing that people don't talk about very much is the health impacts, which is measured from the human toxicity. Human toxicity potential is a measure of the health impact. With internal combustion engines, they are associated with particulates, NOx, unburned hydrocarbons, CO, etc., at the in the tailpipe. Okay, with battery electric vehicles, HTP is associated with mining of metals. Things like cobalt, for instance. And HTP overall has been estimated to be 3 to 5 times worse than for internal combustion engines. And basically what we are doing is we are exporting the health impact to somewhere else where the mining takes place. Again, remember, if you want to completely run all cars with by battery electric vehicles, you have to increase the number of battery capacity. I mean, the battery capacity required by a factor of about 200. Right now, it doesn't sort of register very well. But if you keep on increasing this impact, you can't escape from this eventually. I mean, this will be a very big point going forward as the number of battery electric vehicles increase. Of course, we also have to remember that modern vehicles, Euro 6 diesels, for example, with particulate filters have hardly any particulate emissions because they contain, they carry particulate filters. And then the main source of particulate emissions, PM2.5 and so on, comes from tire wear. And on that score, battery electric vehicles will be much worse because they will weigh up to 30% more than the equivalent internal combustion engine. So when you have millions of BEVs running in city centers, you have to start thinking about this pollution. So as we go forward, as the number increases, as it has to very large level, you must keep all this in mind. Of course, there are many other economic and other implications of forced electrification. For example, cost and availability of new infrastructure, such as public charging points. In the UK, for example, only 22% of the cars have access to garages. And about 55% of the cars, privately owned cars, have to actually park on streets. And they have to, to enable them to charge, you have to have a good public infrastructure for charging points. And there have to be incentives to persuade motorists to buy them because they're still up to $10,000 on average higher upfront costs. Though people keep saying, there were optimistic numbers saying that by 2022, they'll be as cheap as internal combustion. That has not happened, and it's not going to happen, by the way, because of the availability of materials and so on. I'll come to that in a minute, okay? And the lost government revenue from fuel tax. I mean, we'll have to find new ways of taxing transportation, for example, on the number of miles traveled in terms of, and if that is the case, you have to consider the weight of the car as well. In the UK, fuel tax generates about 35 billion pounds a year, and they'll have to recoup this somehow. And the cost and availability of extra electric power needed. I mean, just give you some back of the envelope calculations again. Suppose in the UK, we have 3 million cars in, say, 2030. I mean, that's 10 million battery electric vehicles, say, in 2030. This is a huge increase. I mean, from the current number, about 35 to 40 times more battery electric vehicles in the next 8 years. Out of these, let's assume that only about 3 million of these cars decide to charge at the same time when the drivers come back home from work and plug in. And let's assume that they will only use very low level home chargers with about 3 kilowatts. That's still 9 gigawatts of additional power you need on top of the peak power at that time, okay? That is 3 nuclear power plants, basically. In fact, the UK has just, I think, announced that when new homes are built with new plug-in charging points, they have to be disabled at peak charge peak power requirements. So you can't plug in your car as soon as you come home. You have to wait till the power demand goes down, for example. Eventually, there is a problem of recycling the batteries, which is quite large, and you can read some of the the papers there. Of course, the availability of materials. Once again, remember, we are talking about a 200-fold increase, actually in the past year, lithium prices have increased, quadrupled at least, and this is going to have a big impact on whether the battery electric vehicle costs will come down sufficiently. And there are ethical issues associated with mining of metals. In fact, it's amazing, most environmentalists used to hate mining, probably hate mining more than they used to hate transport. But now this is going to come to the fore again, by the way. So what is the solutions then? Okay, let's look at these other extreme policy things that are happening. In the UK, for example, there's going to be a ban on the sale of new cars with internal combustion engines by 2030. And many other countries and many other states in the US, I think, have similar plans. As I said, even if battery BEV numbers increase, say, 30 to 40 folds to 10 million compared to now, compared to end of 2021, by 2030, 80% of all transport and 70% of light-duty vehicles will still have an internal combustion engine. Okay. And you will need very large investments in infrastructure and in coping with environmental and material requirements. You want to get this amount of increase, for example. Even with such a large increase, will effectively lead to around 5% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. Of course, modern internal combustion engine vehicles could easily deliver this because they will be in the, they'll still be around through improvements in efficiency. If we focus on that, particularly with partial electrification like hybridization, for example. And as I already said, modern cars are extremely clean as far as their emissions are concerned. From the tailpipe. Remember, in many cases, certainly in China, one of the major driving forces, apart from getting a lead on this in this area, was urban air quality. And it is true that battery electric vehicles will make urban air quality better, especially if you replace the old cars with battery electric vehicles. However, as the numbers increase, you have to start worrying about the particulate matter coming from tire wear, which will be much more than the equivalent modern internal combustion engines. And as I've already said, the health impacts of BEVs will really be exported where the mining occurs, and you can't escape from this. And if you want to increase the number by a factor of 200 or something, it will be a huge global problem. Of course, in the UK, from the date of the ban, the customers will be denied access to any new developments in IC technology. It'll be like Cuba in about 35, 40 years. You just see old cars, trundling around UK roads, basically. But more importantly, from our point of view, R&D in this area will stop much before the ban, throwing a lot of talented engineers and scientists on the scrap heap. This is my worry, basically. And of course, if sufficient numbers of the public are not persuaded to buy these because of upfront costs and charging anxiety and so on, essentially the UK automotive industry will be destroyed. I suspect there will be changes on this scope because reality has a habit of intervening with these grand plans, by the way. So what is the future then? My view is that the world has to, my view is basically that, the world has to adapt to any future warming because there is very little chance of global greenhouse gas is coming down significantly or quickly unless really big country, even as I've already pointed out, even countries like the UK with commitment to net zero policies, etc., are not going to go anywhere near this because of the realities of energy transition required. And certainly globally, it is not, it's not going to happen. So, well, are you an optimist or a pessimist? I mean, well, the fact is, it's incontrovertible, by the way, that the world is a far better place in almost all countries not affected by war compared to the past. Things like absolute poverty levels, life expectancy, share of the population that's undernourished, education, childhood nourishment, per capita food consumption, productivity per acre, overall food production have all improved significantly. I mean, very, very significantly. Okay, and so the world has coped extremely well with the changes in the past of about 1.1 degrees increase in global temperature over the past century, in spite of the fact that probably the population is trebled over the past century, and there have been many, many wars and other man-made catastrophes. Of course, going forward, any further increase from 1.1 to, say, if you go to 2.1 or 2.5, another 1.1 degree increase, for instance, will have some consequences of increasing temperature because of increasing greenhouse gases. But as economies grow, they will be better able to cope with these changes. And for growth, you need affordable energy. And I've got a reading list here. Please read certainly Václav Smil's latest book, Steve Koonin's book, Unsettled, and Michael Schellenberg as well. I like that book, Apocalypse Never, and Bjorn Lomborg as well. So these are basically discussed. So let me now come to the conclusion for the time being, summary. The main point is that the scale of the transformation required to meet net zero GHG targets. I mean, when I say net zero, I'm talking about eliminating combustion, okay, of fossil fuels, is extremely large. The urgency and detailed plans to meet such target fall woefully short, even in countries like the UK. All the alternatives to current energy systems start from a very low base and face immense environmental, economic, and material requirement barriers to quick and unlimited expansion. Let me just digress a little bit and think about biofuels, for example. It was not very long ago that biofuels were really pushed. I mean, in fact, you have in the US the biofuel mandate requirement to put biofuels, also in Europe. And most environmentalists now think it's a very bad idea for various environmental points of view, especially if we take into account land use and so on. And it's certainly extremely bad because of the competition for things like corn between fuel and food. However, it's not going to go away, because there are many other drivers. I mean, it comes back to the first slide I showed. There are many other drivers which will push this forward. I mean, for example, in India, there is a lot of interest at the moment from making methanol from coal to replace oil in transport. Why? Because, they want to reduce oil imports. And it's not so important to them at the moment that if you make methanol from coal, you'll have a higher CO2 and greenhouse gas impact. Basically, all the alternatives must be assessed honestly on a life cycle basis. Otherwise, you simply push environmental impacts somewhere else. I mean, and then feel happy that you are doing your bit for the world. The simple fact is, fossil fuels and combustion will continue to be very significant in the next several decades. Okay, so it comes back to my first question. So is combustion research needed? Absolutely, I would say, because it is extremely important to make these systems better. It is true that in many places, combustion of fossil fuels is demonized, and it looks like combustion research is considered, old hat, and you don't need to do all these things. And in any case, we have to remember that extreme weather and natural disasters will simply not disappear even with net zero greenhouse gases. If we accept this reality, and we have to actually, much more emphasis needs to be put on no regrets adaptation policies. So, for example, if you think floods will get worse, we have to invest in flood defense policies. Societies should be made more resilient to any perceived consequences of future climate change. And this can only happen if societies are rich enough. And for that to happen, you need affordable energy in the first place. There are many, many examples of this. Certainly, I mean, in India, from where I come, for example. And you have to remember, there are many real global problems: provision of safe and adequate food, shelter and health, and environmental degradation, and poverty alleviation, because compared to the affluent West, there are large, numbers of people across the world who are in abject poverty. They need to have the basics provided. Okay, so is there a reason for optimism? Well, I would say humanity has coped extremely well with warming of the past century, and we should expect it to cope well with the future warming. And for that to happen, we must continue with combustion research of fossil fuels. Don't get me wrong. I'm not saying we should not do anything else, apart from combustion. We must use all available technologies, and they need to be continuously improved. This includes, wind and solar and battery electric vehicles and everything. They have to be used continuously, but assess them honestly on a life cycle basis is what I'm saying. Right. I think I will stop here, and I have, right, hold on just a minute. I have many of these papers, I've discussed many of these issues, and apart from the applied energy paper, they're all on open access. I think you can access them. And once again, I would recommend, very highly recommend, these 3 books if you are interested in energy and energy development. By Václav Smil, Steve Koonin, and Michael Schellenberger. Thank you very much.
I just turned my camera on, and I turned my speaker on also. I had recently a chance to meet Dr. Steve Koonin, former provost Caltech, and a great scientist and former advisor to the president and Secretary of Energy, Professor Koonin. And I got to spend some time with him. And he's very openly saying that there is no effect of atmospheric CO2, anthropogenic CO2, on climate change. That he is proudly calling himself a climate change denier. So I wanted to know if Kalghatgi's point of view on that, if he agrees with Steve that there is no climate change and anthropogenic CO2 doesn't cause it.
No. I've also spent time with him. In fact, he gave a talk here in November, and we spent some time together. Actually, he doesn't say that what he says is CO2 also has positive impacts, which we do not. For example, global greening, for instance. And he also makes the point, and I think Rolf Reitz would agree with this, that human contributions to CO2 probably are dwarfed by other natural contributions to CO2. But CO2, I don't think he says, as far as I know, that CO2 has no impact on global warming and climate change. I mean, I think his main point, like many of us who are arguing this, is that it's the response to this. I mean, basically, I mean, it is grossly exaggerated about what,
That is fair. That is fair. That is fair. Yes. Yes, that is his main point, is that the response is grossly exaggerated and does not correspond to the challenge. So he disagrees that 350 ppm is the level it needs to be controlled at, and so forth.
Yeah, and I mean, he again is absolutely clear. All these net zero targets that have been set across the world are simply not possible to be met for the reasons that we discussed just now. I mean, it's just the scale of the problem is extremely large. I mean, that's what it boils down to.
Yes, yes. So is it not really an opportunity for the combustion community to become, take the challenge on and become a reacting flows community and say that with renewable sources of energy, with solar and nuclear, it is time to launch CO2 reversal to hydrocarbons as one of the human activities?
Well, I mean, again, it's a question of, scale, I mean, how are you going to do this? I mean, and how are you going to do this at a global level? Look at what's happened to coal, for example. This year, 2020, I mean, in fact, by 2021, when the economy is bounced back, it looks like coal has actually gone above the 2019 consumption. China and India have announced huge investments in coal. I mean, India is a good example. So is China, I think. India has spent, I mean, is been very successful in bringing on solar and wind. I mean, they're investing heavily in this, and the solar and wind are going to go up. However, going forward, the coal use also will go up because the overall energy demand is going up. And if you look at the latest EIA, I mean, 2021 EIA international projections, it's clear. I mean, all oil, coal, and gas, according to them, going to 2050 will increase. The demand will increase, and even though renewables will increase like 3, 4, 5 times faster. Okay, they simply cannot keep up with global energy demand increases. And therefore, we cannot, I mean, so basically what it means is by 2050, 70+% of energy will be coming from fossil fuels, whereas now it's 84% or something like that globally. I mean, but in absolute terms, it will be higher, So combustion is important. Combustion of fossil fuels is important. We have to, I mean, of course, we have to look at all these other things. I mean, things like alternative fuels. I mean, I just pointed out that, there are lots of work going on in alternative fuels, alternatives to fossil fuels. We have to continue with this. But let's not fool ourselves that, you can replace 11 billion plus liters of fossil fuels by any other type of fuels in the next 30 years. It's not possible. If you try to do that, you will have huge environmental and energy requirement issues.
So Gautam, and this is Guang, and I really enjoyed your talk. And I have one comment and one question, right? So my comment was stimulated by Jay's comment about absorbing CO2 from the atmosphere. This is a beautiful thinking, but I am quite skeptical. So let's look at the history, right? We had several environmental crises in our history. The first one was like a London smog, right? The second one was ozone layer. And then there was like a NOx emissions or something.
Mm.
None of them, we solved them by absorb the pollutant from the air. Instead, we solved them by changing the refrigerant,
Right.
and by controlling combustion efficiency and the NOx emissions, right? And then and clean combustion and in coal, we solved all of those problems. I think CO2 is a much bigger scale.
Absolutely.
And then you really look at that, the CO2 fluctuation every year seasonally.
Yeah.
That the forest, of course, absorbs some, depending on the summer, absorbs some of CO2, but is very small compared to overall ppm. If you want to absorb CO2 from atmosphere, the scale is too big for mankind to handle. Right. We even cannot solve the problem of hurricanes, which is very local and how can we absorb all the CO2 from the air? I think this is like it's crazy thinking from my point of view.
Yeah.
So I would say that the advanced combustion with CO2 capture and is a very urgent pathway to reduce CO2, given that the magnitude is so huge. So what is your comment?
Well, again, capture CO2 capture things as well. We're all most of us are engineers here, and you know how much is energy would be required to, first of all, separate the CO2, compress it, and then pump it somewhere else, carry it somewhere else and pump it. And I'm very skeptical of this, by the way. I'm very skeptical that unless carbon dioxide is treated, I don't know, like dioxin or something, and very large carbon taxes come in, it's not going to be feasible. I mean, when I was working in Saudi Aramco, one of my friends and colleagues was working. I mean, they have had the biggest CCS project around, it's not just CCS project. They were trying to inject CO2 into wells to increase, enhanced, and all these engineering problems just crop up. Now you look at across the world, see how many of these things have succeeded and gone to scale. And you pointed out yourself, the scale is very large. There are 49 billion tons of CO2 produced every year. Is it for greenhouse gases? Anyway, about 40 billion tons. How many thousand tons or how many million tons can you do this?
Yeah, my question is also related to this, right? CO2, it is a big threat to the climate change. And at least we are 100% no, but it's close to IPCC said 99% we have confidence. Let's believe that.
Yeah.
Politicians want to net zero carbon to happen tomorrow, right?
Yeah.
And economics and the human, economic basically says that the resource basically said no, wait. So that does not, happen tomorrow. So if you look at that, Germany, right? So Germany, that when you have a Japan nuclear reactor happen, they shut down all of it.
Yeah.
And then now they're using renewable electricity, but so intermittent. They have to burn coal and import gas and oil from Russia, right? And at the same time today, that the fuel price is so high because that the intermittency of political or some other things. And then many countries like China and even United States, that the burning coal is increased because to level off the energy cost. So it's kind of that negative impact in terms of environment, in terms of CO2 reduction because of the wrong policy. So my question to you is that how do we address this net zero carbon policy and economic impact and resilient energy system all together and in terms of our society?
Well, my view, which is what I said in the last stage, we have to accept the reality that you pointed out, in the sense the scale is very large. And we must say, look, let's now focus on adaptation, okay? If there is going to be, now, by the way, when Steve Koonin was here, I mean, we were discussing about this obvious gap between the various net zero targets and the reality. When will they clash? And we agreed that basically when the scale of the problem becomes obvious to a lot of people, and the cost of the problem and the engineering realities start hitting, big. For example, in the UK, that you have to build 40 nuclear power plants in the next 20, that kind of thing. Plus, get rid of cement, steel, aviation, and so on. When that happens, it will start changing. What is extraordinary for me, because of the Ukraine war, is in the last 3 weeks, there has been a tremendous change in the attitude, for example. Now, people here, I mean, certainly in Germany also, Germany has done a major U-turn in many of these things. They are trying to reactivate coal. I mean, they are in fact trying to bring nuclear. I mean, in fact, actually today they agreed not to build any new nuclear power. But in this country, the government has decided that they will put more investment in North Sea oil production. Last year in there was a big report from the IEA saying what the world should do in order to reach net zero, right? One of the first things was there should not be any new investments in new fossil fuel, exploration and production. And of course, the very next day, if Saudi Arabia and Russia say this is nonsense, I mean, this is not going to happen. But now Britain is saying this. I mean, like last week, I mean, because what is become clear now is that apart from climate change in the transition period anyway, it's far more important to have security of supply. Because otherwise people will just die. I mean, if you don't have heating in the winter and so on. And that is what, and I think this kind of thing will moderate some, I mean, this is my hope anyway. I'm an optimist in all respects like this. And we will have more sensible priorities. And by the way, I keep on emphasizing, I'm not saying we should not do any of these other things. We must continue to build wind and solar if they make sense, okay? If they don't cause big environmental issues. And sometimes in some countries you do this, even if they do have environmental impacts because of security of supply and things like that. And now what even the proponents of these things are talking about in this country is don't mention, more wind investments, more solar investments for greenhouse gas control, but for security of supply. We have to be, independent in terms of energy. So there is a change in some kind of attitude because of the realization that there are these are complex issues. And I hope we come to this some kind of a sensible medium in all these things, and just not say, well, we like, many US politicians, and even in this country have been saying, we'll ban fossil fuels from tomorrow, no combustion, things like that. Or only electric vehicles will be allowed. I mean, because they don't make sense environmentally or economically. Let's see what happens. Did that answer your question? I just more of a rant from me.
Yes, thank you very much.
Right. Right. Yeah. Yeah. My main point is that we must use all available technologies, not blinded by ideology. Continue to improve all available technologies, which include, battery electric vehicles, wind, solar, and so on. But let us not delude ourselves. Let's be clear-minded. Let's not lie to ourselves that we can do this, as you said, like some politicians want to do in 5 years' time or 10 years' time or something like that. If you try to force this issue, there will be huge. I mean, I heard Joe Biden saying the other day, imagine, I mean, about the Russian thing, imagine what would have happened if we didn't have fossil fuels. Well, the simple answer is we would all be dead. You know, yeah. I mean, this kind of magical thinking that you can get rid of, which has taken what? I mean, fossil fuels have always been there, but oil and gas over the past 120, 130 years, the industrial economies have grown, and all our, Western countries have a good standard of living because they're using a lot of fossil fuel energy, and you can't persuade people. And certainly people in India, have every right to, aspire to at least some, relief from poverty and so on. And they will therefore use whatever energy that's available, and they have every right to do that. This is why the Indian Prime Minister said this requirement that you should get out of coal is basically colonialism. It's not going to happen. People will not accept it. So we have to accept these realities, is what I'm saying.
Gautam, do you believe that energy or availability of energy should be a basic human right, like availability of food, water, and clean air?
Yeah, sufficient amounts of energy, yes. Because, I mean, I think you can't, you cannot decouple, the availability of food, water, food and water and energy, basically. They're all interconnected. Therefore, I was saying you should please read Václav Smil's new book. It's a superb, explanation of how everything is connected. And Steve Koonen's book as well. It's a very good, exposition of all these problems. I mean, again, unless societies are sufficiently advanced and rich, they will always be prone to suffer from natural disasters. Take India, for example. I remember in the 70s, more than 80s, there were a couple of big cyclones in Orissa. More than 100,000 people died. And last time they had it, only, several orders of magnitude less people died. Why? Because they had much more technology available, and they were more prepared, and they were richer. China is a fantastic example. Look at how many people have come out of abject poverty in China over the past several decades, And people have right to do this. I mean, it's not just the West which has the rights to, freedom from poverty,
What can one do to reduce the, Northern Hemisphere, Southern Hemisphere discussion and East and West discussion and humanity discussion? What
can you do? I don't know. I think it just happened. I mean, in a way, I think, in my opinion, what's happening with Ukraine is sort of catalyzing a lot of these changes. And it may not be for the best if, there's a real dichotomy between the poorer countries and the, there has to be proper cooperation across the board. But I think this is just going to happen as competition for resources and energy will build. As I said, India will continue to use their coal. So will China, and there's no, I think it just happened. I mean, it's just like globalization, I think. I mean, it will just happen, And there might be conflicts because of that. I don't know.
So as suggested, if you have any comments or question to ask, please just unmute yourself and talk to Gautam, please.
One request I have is if we could go to Gautam's last slide.
Oh, no. Yeah, this one, summary slide.
Yeah, no, the last one where you had certain contact or references and so.
Yeah. Okay, but yeah, this one, yes,
Yeah. Mhm.
Mm.
Thank you. Mhm.
Yeah. I mean, I'm willing to share these slides with you, and I'm willing to share the paper on which this whole presentation is based as well. So
Gautam, I have a quick question. If you, yeah. So if we have the infrastructure for hydrogen, how do you see the competition between the application of hydrogen with burning and with fuel cells for, especially for transport applications?
Well, I mean, if we have the main problem with hydrogen, as you know, is production and transport. I mean, the distribution, production, distribution, and storage. I mean, you could argue that fuel cells are more efficient than hydrogen combustion, but you can't say that you might make it. If you develop the hydrogen engines, and people have been working on this for some time, you can make it competitive. It might see, with all these technologies, there will always be somewhere, sometime, someplace it makes sense. Okay, but as far as hydrogen as a solution to the whole problem, I mean, I mentioned, for instance, electrofuels. I mean, hydrogen is a bit better in terms of efficiency of production and so on. But in terms of the scale of liquid fuels we have, how much hydrogen we can make using renewables, because you have to use wind and solar to make hydrogen, basically. Otherwise, it defeats the purpose. I mean, your greenhouse gas emissions might go up. If you look at it that way, I look at things like electrofuels and hydrogen for several decades to come. I think, as a way of enabling, the spread of wind and solar, intermittent renewables, because what it does, it opens up another route, to store excess renewables, because as a number of, as wind and solar increase, there'll always be excess energy, which you need to store. And I already said batteries don't make sense. I mean, batteries also will probably come in, but, but if you could make hydrogen from that, so-called, blue hydrogen or something like that, it'll make sense. So it is not a solution to the whole transport problem. But coming back to your question, I don't know. I mean, I would say basically it looks like fuel cells are more efficient than burning hydrogen in internal combustion engines. But I'm willing to be corrected on this, basically, because with new research and so on. But we have to keep working on all these things, by the way. We have to make this happen. I mean, you have to make hydrogen internal combustion engines and fuel cells they will come, in maybe 30, 40 years time, we will have these engines running. But let's remember, they cannot take over completely. If they did, there'll be huge environmental issues because of production associated with hydrogen and so on, so we have to work on in these areas, and also in how do you control NOx with hydrogen combustion, for instance, from in internal combustion engines, things like that. Yeah.
Thank you. Any other questions?
So Gautam, do you project the data that we all see in terms of life of fossils? Do you feel 50 years, 100 years, or 200 years?
Well, I mean, people, look, as somebody said, it's very difficult to predict, especially
future. Yeah, Yogi Berra said.
Yeah, but what you can say very clearly, is in the next 25, 30 years, right? Fossil fuels will be the major, still may be the major source of energy for fossil fuels and fossil fuel combustion.
25 to 30 years.
30 years. But I mean, this is why I was saying net zero by 2050 is not possible. But who knows, 50, 60, 70 years time, what we can say for sure, looking at the history of technology, is that the energy systems will be different from what they are now, and I mean, there was always this question about, you remember in the 70s and 80s, there was this absolute certainty that we'll be running out of fossil fuels, and of oil, which is what was driving energy policy for several decades at that time. But it looks like there is enough oil. I mean, if you look at the availability of oil, about 30 years ago, there was 30 years of oil available, at that the current consumption rate. Now it's more like 50 years of oil available. And if you keep exploring more, it'll remain like that. I mean, you're not going to run out of oil. This change will not happen because you run out of oil. As Sheikh Yamani said many times, you didn't get out of the Stone Age because you ran out of stones. Because there are better. There will be better solutions for energy, and and humanity will learn to solve the various environmental issues that I talked about associated. This is one of the things that is not sufficiently appreciated, is that so-called renewables and alternatives, they all have very large environmental barriers to quick and unlimited increase. I mean, it just simply cannot happen, basically, because as we increase the number of all these things, I mean, like a number of batteries, etc., you'll run into mining problems and material requirements problems and environmental problems associated with mining and so on. So but you need to learn to live with this. And therefore, coming back to everything that from my title, combustion research and combustion of fossil fuels as well, I'm saying, is going to be extremely important for the next 3 decades or so. And therefore, it is extremely important that we must carry on with combustion research to improve combustion systems. In terms of efficiency, in terms of cleanliness, whatever, Yeah. But there is this danger that some people think it is finished. We shouldn't do this, but that is not true. And hopefully, and this is what I said in the last comments, actually, I'm quite amazed at the change in attitude of some of the people in the last 3 weeks because of what's happening in Ukraine. Suddenly, it has become, at least in this country, very obvious that you have to have energy security. You have to have gas. You have to burn. Even in this country, I mean, now they're trying to bring back dormant coal-powered fire stations, okay? Because of the cost of gas and so on, and natural gas. And all these things, because basically reality is intervening, reality tells you that completely driven by ideology and ignoring engineering realities is not going to help. I mean, it's not going to achieve your aims, basically. That's what it boils down to. Yeah, well, there's something here. There's a lot of parallels between how cars replaced horse carriages in the early 1900s. Yeah. Yeah. He said, well, it says here, there is a lot of Q&A. There's a lot of parallels between how cars replaced horse carriages in the early 1900s. It required gas stations, road construction. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, without this kind of infrastructure development, you can't get electric vehicles, and it will happen, but you have to overcome some of the difficulties associated with electric vehicles. And let us not assume, or rather support this lie that electric vehicles are zero emission vehicles. They are not zero emission vehicles on a life cycle basis. In some cases, there might be lower emission vehicles than equivalent internal combustion engines, but they are not zero emission vehicles. And if you want to increase them by a factor of 200, they will have huge environmental impacts.
I would like to thank Gautam again for the great talk. Yeah, so I think that's the end of our webinar today. And thank you, everybody.